Hey there and welcome back to another Moon Knight review. And today we'll be talking about the latest episode to drop, Asylum, which picks up right after Marc and Steven encounter the Hippo Goddess and begins to give us a lot of answers to the questions that we've had about Marc and Steven's shared past. And Jesus, this episode gets heavy. And it has to be, in my opinion, the best episode of the season so far. It's very exciting to see how far this show's come. Every episode just gets better and better, although I am nervous to see how they're going to wrap up this storyline. I'm pretty sure this is just going to be a standalone season with Moon Knight then moving on to other properties afterwards, so that means they have to have some sort of conclusion here. I'm just wondering if they're going to be able to pull it off with only one episode to go. But anyway, with all that being said, let's jump into the review. So we start off the episode with an image of a cave slowly flooding with water and a woman screaming that this is all your fault. So right from the get-go, it was clear that this was something traumatic in Marc's past that was going to have contributed to the path his life's gone down. And then we cut back to Marc and Steven screaming as the hippo also screams, before we cut back to Marc in the therapist's office, but this time looking pretty beaten up. And we get treated to yet another Harrow monologue. I swear they have so many of these, but each of them so different and so interesting. I gotta say, this guy's a really good actor. And seeing him start to make Marc doubt his reality is very interesting, especially since pretty sure this isn't even Harrow. It's just Marc's mind making him both doubt what's going on and also trying to force him to unpack his trauma. Like on one hand, he starts to believe that everything he's lived, being Moon Knight, meeting gods and goddesses, dying, that it's all nonsense. All a fantasy that his mind's created to deal with his trauma. But at the same time, the fantasy Harrow also encourages him to tell Steven what's going on, to open up to him about his past and explain things, to connect with him so they can both heal. He then tells Marc that his new Hippo character will be able to help him break down the walls between himself and Steven, and then references a boy. And then Marc suddenly snaps and picks up a weapon and tries to leave before getting sedated. But is this actually Marc? I mean, it's Marc earlier in the scene, yes, but after the mention of the boy, I feel like his accent changes and he starts speaking out of the side of his mouth and holding himself differently. And I'm thinking this might have been the protector persona coming out, you know, the one that killed those cultists earlier on in the season in Egypt. And I mean, sadly, they don't really do much else with this character this episode, which is a bit of a shame. But the teasers are clearly there, and I think they are going to unveil him in the finale when Marc has to deal with the aftermath of what happens at the end of this episode. And I hope they don't hold off on him until he appears in a movie or something, because that would be a bit of an anticlimax, and a long wait time. Anyway, the scene cuts back to where we left off with the dynamic duo screaming with the hippo before they all calm down, and she explains that they are in fact dead, and that this whole asylum complex is simply their mind's interpretation of the afterlife, a way of helping them comprehend whatever the hell's going on. Anyway, Marc doesn't deal too well with this and is convinced that they're simply crazy, until he steps outside and turns out they are in the underworld. And I especially liked how Marc was actually excited to be dead instead of just being crazy, and how he kind of gets pumped up to go to the field of reeds. Anyway though, she then puts their hearts on a scale to determine whether they need to be allowed into the field of reeds or damned for eternity. But since their hearts remain in flux, they need to work through their past in order to save themselves. The first of these memories is a room filled with all the corpses of the people Marc has killed since he first became Moon Knight. So yeah, that's pretty dark. And here is where we start to see the first steps of Marc and Steven starting to reconcile, as Marc tells him that he remembers every single person he's had to kill, even though they were apparently all despicable monsters. And even despite them being awful, he can never forget their faces, or who they were. And thus, the scales begin to slow down, because he's opening up, coming to terms with things. And at this point, Steven notices a little boy in the room, and follows him, much to Marc's dismay, and we get our first glimpses at Marc's past. Seeing his family celebrating his little brother's birthday before the two boys go off to explore in a cave and then begin to act like Dr. Grant and his sidekick from the film in last episode. And yeah, it all turns to shit as it begins to rain and the cave floods and his little brother Randall dies as Steven tries in vain to help them. And Marc is forced to enter his traumatic memories to try and prevent Steven from finding out even more. And the first of these next traumatic memories is of Randall's wake, I guess, where Marc's mother has a breakdown and starts screaming at him, blaming him for his brother's death and telling him that he was supposed to look after him. We then see her completely skip his next birthday with only he and his father there to celebrate, and Jesus, that scene is sad. And we then see her ruin what seems to be his very next birthday and imply that he let his brother die on purpose, that he basically murdered him because he was jealous. And then Marc drags Steven away before he can see even more, And they end up outside the house where a scene plays of Marc leaving home as a late teenager, yelling at his father for failing him. So obviously there's more to this story, and the dad was the classic enabler parent who keeps promising it's going to get better, but never helps his son. We then move to the aftermath of the massacre that killed Layla's father, and how Marc dragged himself into Khonshu's temple and was manipulated into serving him, at least according to Stephen's perspective. And after a brief discussion, we see him become Moon Knight for the first time. So yeah, that's some pretty heavy stuff. And it definitely explains a lot about Marc's character. Anyway though, moving on, we then see that Harrow's plan is now kicking into gear, and he's starting to judge people unworthy and send people into the sands before their time to be frozen forever. So I'm guessing at this point, Amit is awake. So the pair convince the hippo to try and help them return to the world of the living via the gates of Osiris, and they head back to try and finish balancing their scales, with Stephen thinking that they need to return to their childhood bedroom, and Marc just being firmly against it to the point of having another episode and returning to the therapy room with Harrow. Fantasy Harrow then manages once again to point Marc in the right direction, telling him they can't move forward if he doesn't open up to Stephen and show him the truth about their life. Just really great acting throughout this whole sequence. Oscar Isaac is truly amazing this episode. And then he's doubly great in the next scene where we get to see what happened after Marc ran away from his mum on his birthday and then hid in his room. And it turns out his mum ends up physically abusing him alongside the mental abuse, and that this caused him to manifest the identity of Stephen, a man whose mother does love him and who has a happy and safe life, who Marc can retreat into when it all gets to be too much for him. And then Marc starts dropping bombs about how Stephen is his escape and that their mum hated them, made their life hell, and is now dead. And this, of course, causes Stephen to snap and wake up in the therapist's office himself with Fantasy Harrow, because, yeah, fair enough. Finding out your entire life is a construct designed to protect somebody else from abuse and help them forget would probably be pretty traumatizing. And much like earlier with Marc, he manages to help him break down his walls and accept what's happened. To accept that his mother's dead and that she'd been abusive. And Jesus, this whole episode is just so sad, but my god, the acting is great. By pretty much every single actor as well, so that's pretty impressive in my book. Anyway, we then see Stephen watch as Marc almost visits his father after his mother's death, but he can't go through with it, as he doesn't want to give her the satisfaction of him caring that she died. And then we see him become Stephen in this moment, with real Marc revealing to real Stephen that this was the moment that their lives began to blend together and they lost that barrier that they had from before. Stephen then absolves Marc of his role in his brother's death and tells him that he was just a child, and that the things that their mother did to him were wrong, and that he didn't deserve them. Just as the boat arrives at the gate of Osiris, and they're told that they've run out of time to balance their scales, and so the pair get swarmed by the sand monsters of the Duat, which try to drag Marc overboard, only for him to be saved by Stephen, who in turn falls overboard and is frozen just as the scales balance, teleporting Marc into the field of reeds to end the episode. Phew, that's a heavy ending. But I mean, it's very clear that Stephen is not going to be staying there forever. Marc is going to find his way out of the field of reeds, probably by talking to one of the gods, who will in turn free Khonshu so he can come back to life. And I mean, I don't know whether they're going to save Stephen next episode, or whether that's going to be a future storyline for Marc, because we also have to deal with the third persona who's been heavily teased as well, and it just feels like with that, and then Layla and Harrow needing to be addressed as well, there isn't really enough time to free Stephen in a satisfying way. So they might have to make do with a bittersweet ending for now, and leaving it on a cliffhanger. But anyway, with all that being said, that's the end of the episode. And these were just my opinions on things, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the episode? You like it? Hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.